Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. I've started out this year by listening to a lot of podcasts. It began when I was doing a massive clean of our basement in preparation for Sarah's brother and his wife to visit us just after New Year's, and we needed to get the space ready for them. And I found that the stories of podcasts were a really helpful companion for this task. But it's continued on from there. Anytime I'm out for a walk, or in the car, or riding the subway, or even a few minutes of cleaning the kitchen at the end of the night, I quickly pull up the little purple icon of the podcasts on my phone, and I get pulled in to a new world. And what struck me over the past few weeks especially is that all of the podcasts and the episodes I've been listening to have a strikingly sad and emotional tone to them. I'm not seeking out, it seems, stories that are joyful and funny or will necessarily lift me up, but rather I'm listening to a lot of content that's pulling me deep into the ache of the human experience, into the guts and mess and muck, the fullness of life, the ache and the awe. One of my favorite podcasts with theological historian Kate Bowler is entitled Everything Happens. I've been listening to this one for a while now. She ended 2022 with 2 back-to-back episodes that she shared with another podcaster, Kelly Corrigan, where in the first one they focused on the highlights of 2022 and told some beautiful and hilarious stories about each of their years. They took an inventory of all that felt positive, but they couldn't leave it there because, as they acknowledged, just the happy doesn't indeed give a full picture of a year or a life, does it? So the following episode, then, they told stories of all the things that hadn't gone well. The moments of sadness, the grief, the trouble, again, the ache and the awe. They called this double hitter the happies and the crappies. In one of these episodes, Kelly Corrigan tells this story about many years before. She was auditioning to be the speaker at her college graduation. She really wanted to give this commencement speech, but she got runner-up. The person who beat her out was a classmate who always seemed to beat her at all the other things in every area of life. Maybe you have someone in your life who's like that, or had someone in your life who always just seemed to get that one spot ahead of you. When Kelly was auditioning to give the speech, her dad treated it as if he and Kelly were auditioning together. It was his task as well. "We've got this, Lovey," he'd keep telling her as she was preparing. So when she found out that she got runner-up and that, in fact, Emmeline Waltner got it, as she often did, she called her dad up and she told him, "Dad, you'll never guess who got it. It was Emmeline Waltner." And he responded as if the loss was his own. "Ah, that Emmeline Waltner, always beating us. We're going to take her out one of these days." For what it's worth, Kelly Corrigan does her dad's voice very well, much better than I could do. So jump ahead a few decades, and Kelly continues her story, explaining that this past year she got invited back to give the commencement speech to this year's graduating class at her alma mater. 30 years after she was the runner-up to give the speech at her own graduation. Her dad has since died. Kelly talked about the experience of going back to give this speech and how she couldn't separate this highlight moment from this year from the experience of not giving the speech 30 years prior. She kept feeling the sense of, if only her dad could have seen her, how proud he would have been. She went on to say, "The thing is, you never know how long the story you're in is going to be. It could have been a story of, and then Emmeline Walter got to give the speech, and that's the end. But it wasn't the end. And so often we don't know while we're in these stories. It reminded me of last week's service where we explored the theme of God's time, that is indeed not our time. And it's one, I believe, that also connects to and draws us into our gospel reading for today, which Dio shared with us this morning, where we encounter another familiar Jesus story. Last week, we heard that call of the first disciples as told in the Gospel of John. Well, this week, it's Matthew's take on the call of the first disciples. As opposed to John, where Simon and his brother Andrew were walking through the streets of Jerusalem with John the Baptist, for the writer of Matthew's Gospel, they're fishing with their father, Zebedee. And meanwhile, Jesus, he's out for a walk along the beach. And at first, it might seem as if he's aimlessly walking. But by the end of the story, we know that indeed he was walking with purpose. He sees the three fishing off in the distance, and he approaches them as they bring in their nets and their boats. And Jesus boldly says to the two brothers, "Come, and I will make you fish for people." And without even a second of hesitation, Simon and Andrew leave their father, they leave their nets, their boats, their workplace, and the waters behind. It's a story of profound change. They just leave their nets and their boats behind and they follow Jesus. I mean, from the way that the story goes, they don't even say goodbye to their father. They just walk away, change as abrupt as it can come. But the thing is, I don't think it's as abrupt as Matthew would make it seem. I think that likely Simon and Andrew were very spiritual men. Maybe it was even their father who told them the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures or taught them how to be good people, how to help others, how to be good friends. So maybe they've been experiencing a spiritual longing for quite some time. Maybe they've been looking for ways to live out this hunger and this calling. Perhaps this encounter with Jesus on the beach was a moment of many moments leading towards a personal transformation. A story that was already unfolding before Matthew's telling of it begins. And I think because of all of this, the brothers, they weren't naive. They knew that this would be a hard task, even though throughout the Gospels we hear of all the mistakes and issues that come up with those followers, with the disciples. I don't believe they got into it unknowingly. Because Jesus doesn't call them to just the happy, just the good, just the easy. Jesus calls them to the hard, to the muck and the mess and the real, the full spectrum of the human experience. In Jesus' calling of the disciples to the fullness of life, we see an echo of Jesus calling to us to the fullness of life. It's not meant to be pretty. As another one of my favorite podcasters, Glennon Doyle, often says, maybe the purpose of life isn't just to be happy, maybe it's to be human. And that means not just the joy, the happy, but also the crappies. God invites us. God invited those first disciples. God invites all to do ordinary things in the middle of ordinary moments. To me, Zebedee is a great symbol of this, that father figure in this story. And for St. Matt's folks who have been around for some time, you've heard me many sermons on this text focus on Zebedee. I find him to be a particularly captivating figure in this story. Maybe what we see as ordinary action through him is actually the most extraordinary part. of this story. Like Zebedee staying back and empowering his sons to go. I was really struck by this element of this story when listening to Rebecca and Emily sing this morning, Winter Song. One line in particular, I'll be your harvester of light. I believe that that's what Zebedee was doing in empowering his sons to go and follow their call. He was staying back, harvesting the light for them to move into the change and uncertainty of this new thing with Jesus. Which means that even when God calls us to do ordinary things in the middle of ordinary moments, we are in fact being called to something quite extraordinary. Because there is something extraordinary in staying with the community, in working through those times of grief and sadness or hurt and despair. And I'm sure Zebedee felt some of those things too. His own sadness for his sons going, but also the work of the community. So I want to close by telling you one more podcast story. I think the subtitle of this sermon might as well be Podcasts I Love. This is a new podcast that I just discovered during my basement overhaul project. And it's called All There Is with Anderson Cooper. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Anderson Cooper. Where he's put together an 8-episode series focused entirely on grief, diving deep into the experiences of death and loss and heart-wrenching grief, rooted in his own experiences of death of his brother, who died by suicide when he was in his 20s, his father, and most recently, Anderson's mother. In each episode, Anderson Cooper, a famous CNN war correspondent, interviews folks such as Stephen Colbert, or actor Molly Shannon, filmmaker Kirsten Johnson, or palliative care physician B.J. Miller, to together explore various facets of the human experience of grief. And as I've been listening to and captivated by, and sometimes even sobbing through these conversations, I've been reminded again and again just how human grief is. How in so many ways it's uniting. Cooper began this podcast somewhat accidentally, in fact. His mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, had died, and it took a few years for Cooper to finally get around to cleaning out the contents of her apartments. And as he described, she was a keeper, so there was lots of stuff in her apartments. He decided to record himself going about this task, and quickly realized through these recordings that there could be something here. It might be worth sharing this experience with others and bringing in the experiences of grief of others to expand the narrative and conversation. Throughout the 8 episodes, Anderson Cooper tells many stories, and his guests tell many stories as well, but there's a few that stood out to me in particular as he described the experience of saying goodbye to his mother and letting go of her things and the memories that they held, and trying to discern how to do that. He told one story, in fact, it was captured by audio as he discovered it. He was going through his mother's closet and found a small package of tissue and opened up the tissue to find a blouse and a shirt, and on top of them a note that said, Anderson, this was what I was wearing the day Carter died. Carter was Anderson's brother. She had kept it, knowing that one day he would find it, entrusting him with what to then do with it. Throughout his interviews and his storytelling, Anderson Cooper cries quite a bit through much of this podcast, and I love it. Because so often on something like a podcast or an interview, the person who's interviewing, I think, feels like they have to be polished, they have to be put together, not let their own emotions get to them. But in this case, it's beautiful and refreshing and oh so real. And through his experiences, folks start writing in and calling the show, and as the episodes go on, they play sound bits of others telling their stories of grief and loss and the impact that Anderson Cooper's rawness and grief has had on them. Through his grief, others find light and hope, and indeed realize that the ache and the awe aren't that separate after all. As we go off into this week, holding these stories perhaps, but holding the stories that you'll carry with you, holding the story of Jesus and the disciples, discerning our own calls in this broken and beautiful world, may we be reminded that the task indeed is to journey together with friends and community through the ache and through the awe, which just might be one and the same. May it be so.